Before this season started, back in August, you couldn't tell nobody that the Jaguars weren't going to win the AFC South. You had people who were hyping up Trevor Lawrence to be an MVP candidate. You had people in the national media such as Colin Cowherd who were picking the Jaguars to get the number 1 seed in the AFC. And then imagine a couple of months later, the Jaguars going from 8-3 to out of the playoffs. The downfall of the Jaguars has to be talked about. Trevor Lawrence, this dude is a bust. At this moment right now. He's not a bust because he's a bad quarterback, but he's a bust because he hasn't lived up to the high expectations that were put upon him when he got taken by the Jaguars first overall a couple of years ago. He was tabbed as a generational quarterback. He was supposed to be the next Andrew Luck. And I've yet to see anything generational about Trevor Lawrence. When he's on, he's a really good quarterback. He's a top 10 quarterback. No doubt about that. But here's the problem with Trevor Lawrence. This dude is like a light switch, on and off every single week. One week he plays good. The next week he plays awful. The next week after that, he plays mid. He doesn't take care of the football. He looks really shaky when he gets pressure in his face. And he's really volatile. And I don't think the dude is, terrible. I only call him a bust because it's similar to how if you follow the NBA, people used to call Andrew Wiggins a bust. Andrew Wiggins wasn't getting called a bust because he was terrible. He was getting called a bust because he didn't live up to the hype that comes with being the number 1 overall pick. And Trevor Lawrence is the epitome of that. And maybe there were too many high expectations for Trevor Lawrence. All right, maybe people jumped the gun giving this dude the generational label. And maybe Caleb Williams could suffer the same fate. But Trevor Lawrence, man, this dude just self-imploded against the Tennessee Titans. He threw 2 interceptions that were really awful. He overthrew Evan Ingram. And he played so bad that there were Jaguar fans during the game on social media saying that maybe they had a better chance at beating Tennessee if they didn't play Trevor Lawrence. I had to tell one of my homeboys that no. Regardless if Trevor Lawrence wasn't fully healthy or not, this dude is supposed to be your franchise quarterback. That means that regardless if he's 100% or if he's 70 or 80%, he gives you a better shot than whoever else you have behind him on the bench. But there were a lot of Jags fans that really believe that they will be in the playoffs right now if they started C.J. Beathard. That's cold. That's really cold. You could have beaten the Baltimore Ravens if Trevor Lawrence wasn't turning the football over left and right. This dude is a turnover machine. Anytime you get a little bit of pressure in his face, he just unravels. But when you can keep this guy protected, you can keep him upright, throwing from a clean pocket, he's a really good quarterback. But he's just so inconsistent. And not just is he inconsistent, but the whole entire team is inconsistent. Doug Peterson, he doesn't have to go, but his offensive coordinator, Press Taylor, has to go, and that defensive coordinator needs to go too. Doug Peterson, I thought he was calling the plays at one point. I never knew that he had somebody else as his OC calling the plays. So he needs to find another OC that is better calling plays, that can find a way to maximize Trevor Lawrence's potential. Trevor Lawrence has yet to reach his ceiling. If Trevor Lawrence is able to put it all together, this dude should arguably be the best quarterback in the NFL. All right, nobody denies the talent and potential that Trevor Lawrence has. Nobody's saying that he's a bad quarterback. But for some reason, the coaching staff down there that Doug Peterson has in place in Jacksonville doesn't know how to get the best out of this dude on a week-to-week basis. You never should have gotten blown out by the San Francisco 49ers. You should have been able to stay with those boys. They were a better team than you. Not saying that you should have won that game, but you definitely shouldn't have gotten humiliated the way that you did. This team is a lot better than what I initially thought coming into this season. And I never really felt like the Jaguars were going to be a Super Bowl contender this year like how many people thought they would be. I live in Jacksonville. People were saying, oh, JT, you don't know nothing about the Jaguars. Who's watching the Jaguars? Me, fool. I live in Jacksonville. I've lived in this city all my life. I've been watching Jaguars football since David Garrard. So trust me, I know about the history of the Jaguars. I know about the Jaguars' history and their weaknesses and strengths. And Trevor Lawrence is the best quarterback that this franchise has had since Blake Bortles. And not even him. He's the best quarterback that this franchise has had ever. So, of course, he's not going anywhere. You're not going to trade this dude. You need to find a way, if you're Doug Peterson, to get this dude playing at a top 5 level, which is what he's definitely capable of. We've seen Trevor Lawrence have great performances, but this was a down season for him. And he's the main reason why Jacksonville missed the playoffs. The defense played pretty good the first 8 games of the season. Then he had some injuries in the secondary, and then they completely fell apart. But anytime they played against a solid offense, even when they were healthy, they got carved up. Like Jacksonville, I think them missing the playoffs is the best thing that could happen to this organization. You know, they had a lot of hype going into the season. Everybody was giving them high praise for nearly beating Kansas City in last year's playoffs. But you see, when you get so much praise from people, it's easy to overlook your biggest weaknesses. And the biggest weaknesses that Jacksonville had coming into this year that nobody talked about was their inconsistency on defense. Like last year, their defense wasn't that great. Their defense was only good when it came to forcing turnovers in big moments. They weren't a great unit. And even the offensive line coming into this season was out of sorts. Like, we knew Jawan Taylor was a little bit overrated. We see that coming full circle in Kansas City right now. I'm pretty sure they regret giving Jawan Taylor all that money. But when you moved on from him, you never found the serviceable replacement. You know, your offensive line wasn't good. People didn't talk about that. People didn't talk about how the pass rush was inconsistent outside of Josh Allen. Like, Trayvon Walker is coming along, but Aiden Hutchinson is still a much better player. Gets more pressures, impacts the game a lot more than what Trayvon Walker does. Like, he's better in run support. That's cool. It's a passing league. You need to be able to affect the quarterback. Trayvon Walker doesn't do that at the level that you expect for somebody who gets taken number 1 overall. You see, like, the Jaguars have a lot of talented young pieces that just needs better coaching to unlock their full potential, to get them playing at their highest level. You see, like, the Jaguars this season, I never bought into the hype on them. And a lot of people from in the city that I'm friends with were saying how I was sleeping on the Jaguars. I never was sleeping on the Jaguars. Like, I just was realistic about this team. I felt this team, at best this season, would be good enough to go to the divisional round. And I thought that they would win the AFC South. But who would have thought that not only would they not make it to the playoffs, but the Texans of all teams would win this division? Like, who would have thought? This team's expectations were way too high, and they weren't obviously able to handle them. They weren't able to live up to them. It's funny how not only do you have a quarterback that can't live up to expectations, but you just have a team that as soon as they got a little bit of expectations from the national media, people started talking about them, they started playing bad. They went from 8-3, being in contention to win the 1 seed, to out of the playoffs. The downfall of Jacksonville this year was really disappointing. And you know, like, the fans showed up to nearly every single home game. Like, all of the home games were sold out. They were lit. You want to know why? Because people were going to the games because they had a shot at winning the division. They had a shot at not only making it to the playoffs, but potentially making a deep playoff run. People in Jacksonville were really high on Jacksonville or high on the Jaguars coming into this season. And I was telling people, like, I was made public enemy number 1. You guys can go back and watch the content that I made about Jacksonville before the season started. I was going back and forth with everybody saying how this team just wasn't ready to compete yet. This was never a team that was built to win the Super Bowl this year. I felt they were an offseason away from being legitimate contenders. Oh, but we got Calvin Ridley. Cool, you got Calvin Ridley, but you didn't know how to use him until like the last couple of weeks into the season. I had this dude on my fantasy team. I invested a first-round pick in Calvin Ridley, bro. He's one of the biggest disappointments in fantasy football this year. You got Evan Ingram, who gets wide open in big moments of games, and Trevor Lawrence either throws the ball in the dirt to him or just completely misses him. Like, this team is just all over the place. You got a quarterback who's all over the place. Like, when I watch Trevor Lawrence play, like, It's really weird sometimes because sometimes he just looks a little clumsy. It's just like he'll run with the football and he'll be like rumbling, stumbling all over the place. Like the dude will be throwing balls into the dirt. Like he'll be making like head scratching interceptions. It's just like, what the hell am I watching right now? Like, what the hell am I watching out of the Jacksonville Jaguars? Like, honestly, bro, like, I've watched so many Jazz games this year, and I just used to be asking myself, like, what the hell am I really witnessing right now? Like, is this really the Jaguars team that people thought could win the 1 seed? Is this really who people thought could be a dark horse Super Bowl contender? Is this really the quarterback who people were thinking could potentially win MVP this year? Like, Jacksonville was all over the place this year, man, and this was a good thing for this franchise. Because you see, what would have happened is that Jacksonville would have went to the playoffs and it would have ran it back with the same coordinators. And that would have been a problem. The coordinators are not good. Everybody gets caught up in the takeaways and whatnot and starts using all these excuses. You see, when you make excuses, it puts you in a bad position, because when you make excuses for what needs to be changed, it ultimately ends up coming back to bite you in the you-know-what. And that's what happened to Jacksonville this year. They should have moved on from their offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator last year. The offense was inconsistent last year. The only reason they started getting a little bit of notoriety from the national media was because the offense late last season started to get a little hot. You know, you had that game against the Dallas Cowboys. You had that comeback against the Los Angeles Chargers, despite all the interceptions that Trevor Lawrence threw. Like, if you want a good example of what Trevor Lawrence is as a quarterback, what he is at his worst, and what he is at his best, go back and watch that LA Chargers wild card matchup when they lost to the Jaguars last season. The first half of that game was the Trevor Lawrence that you could see when he's at his worst. He's turning the football over. He's making bad decisions. He's all over the place. He's being clumsy with the ball. He's overthrowing guys. And then the second half of that game, you see the Trevor Lawrence that many people envisioned him being when he got selected number 1 overall years ago by Jacksonville. A top 5 quarterback, a quarterback who can make all the throws, has great athleticism, even though he is tall and he does have a little bit of a weird running style. Like, you got a dude who could potentially be the best quarterback in the game. Like, that Chargers game against the Jaguars was a tale of two halves for not just Trevor Lawrence in that game specifically, but his career. In the second half, you saw what he could be at his best. And in the first half, you got a glimpse of what this dude is at his worst. Jacksonville needs to find more consistency. This season was a massive disappointment. And when I make my most overhyped teams list in the next couple of days, they're definitely going to be on it. And they're probably going to be number 1, bro. Like, so many people were so high on Jacksonville this year, and I couldn't believe it. I really couldn't believe it, bro. Like, oh, you don't know shit about Jacksonville, bro. I know you're not watching the Jaguars play, because who's watching the Jaguars play? Maybe you don't know, but I'm from Jacksonville, bro. I've been watching this team my whole entire life. I done seen it all in Jacksonville. I remember when we drafted Blaine Gabbert, fam. It was a time when Blaine Gabbert came to my school when I was in elementary, right? And we booed this dude on stage, bro. Nobody wanted to hear him talk. Like, bro, like, I remember when we did Maurice Jones-Drew dirty and we didn't want to pay him and he went to the Raiders. Like, I remember everything about this organization, bro. So if there's anybody that you're going to get an unbiased opinion from when it comes to the Jaguars, it's going to be me. Like, I'm from the city, bro. I'm in top with the team. Yo, you hating on Jacksonville, bro. Why does everybody got to hate on Jacksonville? Oh, you don't want to see the Jaguars have a little bit of success? Oh, we almost beat Kansas City. Who cares about almost? Almost only counts in the horseshoe. Did you get the win? No, you didn't. There were so many people who had so many high expectations for Jacksonville when they didn't deserve it. This team at best was going to be a divisional round exit. At best, that was it. This team is just inconsistent. That's all they've been under Doug Peterson the last couple of years. Like, Trevor Lawrence took a massive leap in year 2. That was to be expected when you had Doug Peterson coming in, replacing one of the worst head coaches in the history of the NFL in Urban Meyer. But year 3, I possibly would consider this to be a sophomore slump for Trevor Lawrence. Although it wasn't his second season, it was his third season, but technically, this was his sophomore season because we can't even count his rookie season. The coaching was so bad that, it was hard to really evaluate the dude. So this was a slump for Trevor Lawrence this season. This whole entire Jaguars team just completely fell off the rails after they started out 8-3. Like, once they started playing some good teams, like the 49ers and the Ravens and even the Bengals, like, they got exposed. And before I end this, like, I told my homie who was picking the Jacksonville Jaguars to cover against Tennessee, like, you're making a big mistake, fam. Like, Mike Vrabel is the last coach who you should ever bet against the last week of the season, especially when you have a quarterback as turnover prone and inconsistent as Trevor Lawrence. Like, this is a good thing for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Like, now they got no more excuses for why they don't need to make a change at coordinator, because they do. They need to bring in a new OC, a new DC, go into the offseason, get some better corners, get some more talent on the interior of that defensive line, also get some more talent on the interior of that offensive line as well. Like, the Jaguars aren't too far away from being contenders. And I actually believe that next season is probably going to be the year where they finally live up to the Super Bowl expectations. You see, when Jacksonville is going to be good is when a lot of people are counting them out, because next season everybody's going to be so infatuated with the Houston Texans and Anthony Richardson coming back, and there's going to be a little bit of talk about Will Levis, and with the Jaguars ending this season with how they did, everybody's going to look at that and they're going to say, man, you can't trust Trevor Lawrence. He's too turnover prone. Oh, you can't trust Doug Peterson. Some of his in-game decisions are a little bit questionable sometimes. So people are going to write off Jacksonville next year. And that's going to be the season when Jacksonville ends up living up to the expectations that people have for them this season. But this year, they just weren't ready. Like, they overachieved last season in a sense. Like, they beat the Chargers in the wild card. They beat the worst head coach in the NFL in the playoffs that year. Brandon Staley, where is he? He's fired. Like, the best win that the Jaguars have this season is against who? Like, the Pittsburgh Steelers? That's about it. And if you would have played Pittsburgh again with Mason Rudolph at QB, you probably don't win that game. So, this season for the Jacksonville Jaguars, like, massive, massive disappointment. Like, this team was so overhyped this year. So overhyped. But this season would do a lot of good for them moving forward, because now you know what needs to be changed. You know what needs to be improved. You know what you need to do in the offseason if you're Doug Peterson. Get some new coordinators in there. Beef up the interior of the O-line, D-line. Maybe get a couple of more corners, and you'll be straight next season. Like, I expect Jacksonville to be competing for a Super Bowl next season. Like, I never felt like this year was the year the Jaguars were going to be a legitimate contender. I always felt that 2024, in hindsight, was the year that the Jaguars were going to be able to put it all together.